We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 51a. On the previous Amud of Nachman said that if an ox fell into a water channel, it was less than 10 tvachim. He said you still have to rule that that ox might be a treifa because the impact might have caused mortal wounds to that particular ox. And the Gemara asked a question from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah talked about a case where an ox falls into a pit that is less than 10 tvachim and it dies. And we say that the owner of the pit is not responsible since it's less than 10 tvachim. That's not considered to be a pit that's able to kill. And that's a direct question on Rav Nachman. If we're saying that it does not have the impact to be able to kill, how could Rav Nachman say that it's considered to be a treifa? And the Gemara answers, lo no, misham deles behavlo. What's actually going on in the Mishnah, it's not that if it's less than 10 tvachim, it can't kill through the impact. The impact actually is able to kill, but you're not responsible for the impact. We're following Rav over here, that a boar is chayav because of the hevel, because of the bad air in the boar. And if it's less than 10 tvachim, it doesn't have hevel, it doesn't have that bad air. As Rashi explains, lo misham deles behavlo, no, rather, the Mishnah is talking about that there's no hevel in such a pit. Aval chavota isbe, but there is impact in such a pit. Va'afilu hachi pater, nevertheless pater. Why? Because kirav, again, we're following Rav over here, and we're saying that a boar is chayiv because of the hevel. And the Gemara continues, Ihachi, if so, huzak bo chayiv. So it says that if the animal is damaged and doesn't die, so then the person who's the owner of the pit is chayiv. Halas behavla. Didn't you just say there's no hevel? Why is he chayiv for nezek? And to that the Gemara answers, Amarle said to him, Ein hevel lemisa, v'yesh hevel l'nizak. And there's no hevel in order to kill the animal. There's enough hevel to cause injury. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei, we have a question from a Mishnah in Sanhedrin. The Mishnah says, Beis HaSkila haya gavoa shtei komos, that the Beis HaSkila, that's where they gave someone skila stoning, so they would first push him over a cliff. So it had to be the height of two people, meaning to say if you had one person standing on top of another person, that height, Betani Allah, and then it was taught on that Mishnah, the Kom Mishalo, you also have to add his height because he's standing on the top of the cliff, Harekan Shalosh, so it actually comes out that it's the height of three people. And so the Gemara says, now if Rav Nachman is right, if you think that there is considered impact that can be mortal at less than 10 tvachim, why does it need to be so high for? But the Gemara says, but according to your reasoning, if you're already asking that question, so Navid Asara, so why not make it 10 tvachim high? Why does it have to be so high? And so the Gemara says, Elika Rav Nachman, rather the answer is like Rav Nachman said, the Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, because Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, V'yohavta l'reacha kamocha, you love your friend like yourself, Borer lo misa yafa, you have to choose for him a good misa, meaning to say he should die quickly, it shouldn't be so painful. The Gemara says, Ihachi, but if that's the case, so nagvatve, so make it even higher. And to that the Gemara says, Mishum de menuvel, the reason is because then the body already is going to break upon impact, it's going to become different limbs separated from each other, which is already disgusting, that we don't want to do. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei, we have a question from the following brayso, so the Pasuk says, Ki yipol hanofel mimenu, it says that the person is going to fall off the roof, that's why you have to build a fence around the roof, and so we darshan mimenu v'lo besocha, it means you're going to fall from the roof, but not into the roof. Keitzad how? So, Haisa Rishas Harabim, Gavoa mimenu asar tvachim, let's say the Rishas Harabim is actually higher than the house. If it's 10 tvachim higher than the house, v'nafal mitocho l'tocho, and then you could fall from it onto the roof. So pater, in that situation, he's pater, he doesn't have to build the roof. But amuka mimenu asar tvachim, but if the Rishas Harabim is lower from the top of the roof, 10 tvachim, v'nafal mitocho l'tocho, so you're falling from the roof to the Rishas Harabim, in that case chayiv, so then he's chayiv to build the roof. And the Gemara says, now if you think like Rav Nachman said, that impact can cause death even less than 10 tvachim, why do we have to talk about over here 10 tvachim? Why does it have to be specifically that amount? And the Gemara says, Amarle said back to him, Shani bias. It's different when you're talking about halachas involving a house, because if it's less than 10 tvachim, it's not even called a house. Only a house is chayiv in a makkah, only a house is chayiv to have that fence around the roof. The Gemara says, if so, hashta nami, to have a me'avroy asara. But if that's the case over here also, when from the outside it's 10, that should be enough. But the Gemara continues, if so, if that's the case, that the reason it is that it has to be called a bias, hashtanami dehave me'avroi hasar. Now also, let's say from the outside, meaning from the top of the roof down to the Rosh Hashanah is 10 tvachim, but dal minei tikru maziva, you have to remove the external part of the roof that raises it up to that 10 tvachim, migavoi lo have hasar. If the person is inside the house, it's not actually going to be 10 tvachim high to the ceiling, and therefore it still should not be called a house. And the Gemara says to that, Amarle said to him, Kagon dechak migavoi. The case over here is that on the inside of the house, they actually dug down the floor a little deeper, and so it actually is 10 tvachim within. And the Gemara says, if so, kilo have enami me'avrei asara. But then if that's the case, even if it's not 10 tvachim from the outside, mashkachas lo dahave migavoy asara, still you could have a case where on the inside it's 10 tvachim. Could go into chakba tfei. Let's say they dug into the floor a little bit more. So why does it have to be from the outside 10 tvachim? And so the Gemara says, Ella rather, Hainu time of the Rav Nachman. The reason of Rav Nachman is as follows, meaning going back to Rav Nachman that said that if the animal falls into the water channel, which was less than 10 tefachim, Rav Nachman said it might have a mortal wound, it might be a treifa upon impact, and now it seems to be that's not the case. Only 10 tefachim really creates that kind of a mortal wound. So the real reason of Rav Nachman is, Savar, he holds, Mikresa de Torah la'ara, from the stomach of the ox to the ground, Kamma hava, how much of a distance is that? Arba, that's already 4 tefachim. And Arisa de Daloi Kamma hava, how much is this water channel? She said it's 6 tefachim, ha'asara, so you have to add the 4 to the 6, and it really is 10 tefachim. It's not that Rav Nachman was saying there might be a mortal wound less than 10 tefachim. This case actually is 10 tefachim. It comes out that when there's the moment of impact, it actually is from a height of 10 tefachim. But the Gemara says, but the Mishnah says that the bore, the pit, has to be 10 tefachim deep in order to kill. So to anything, it has to be at least 10 tefachim. But now we're saying, now we're saying that 6 tefachim is actually enough, because again, you have to count that space to the stomach of the animal. And the Gemara answers to that, Amri, they say, Masnisin de Igandur Lavor. In the Mishnah, it's talking about a case where the animal is rolling into the pit, so you don't have that extra space. So there you actually need the full 10 tefachim. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Bor shel shnei shutvin. Let's say you have a pit that is owned by 2 partners. Avar olav harisha. Now the first person, he leaves velo chiseu, he doesn't cover it up. V'hasheni velo chiseu, and then the second one leaves, and he doesn't cover the pit. Hasheni chayiv. The second person is the one who will be chayiv. And Rashi explains, Hasheni chayiv harishon pater, it means the second one is chayiv and the first one is pater. Uvegemara mukila. Now the Gemara will say that's not always true. It's specifically talking in a situation b'shehinicho rishon l'sheni mishtamish, that when the first person left, he left and the second person was then using the board. He essentially took over responsibility. V'do l'kishalachlo, he continued to take water from the pit when the other person left. So he's essentially transferring over the responsibility to the second person. That's why the second person is chayiv and not the first. And the Gemara says, Amri, they said as follows, Bor shel shnei shutfin, heichi mashkachas. How is it that we even have a pit that belongs to partners? Now, Hanichi svir lon Rabbi Akiva. Now, it works out if we follow Rabbi Akiva. To Amar bor b'reshus chayiv. Rabbi Akiva says that a bor in a person's own reshus is chayiv. So mashkachas la b'chatzer shel shneim, ubor shel shneim. Then the case could be simply where they both own the chatzer, they both own the bor, v'hifkiru reshusan v'lo hifkiru boren, and then they make their reshus ownerless, so people are allowed to walk there, but they don't make the bor ownerless, and so there you have a situation where you actually have a bor that is owned by partners. But if we hold that a bor in a person's own reshus is pater, and really what the bor that we're talking about that's chayiv is a bor b'reshus harabim, the only case that you have a chayiv of bor is in reshus harabim. Over reshus harabim, bor shel shnei shutfin. How do you have a case of a bor b'reshus harabim that belongs to 2 partners? And the Gemara says, Ida shavu shliach tarvayu. Now, if you're going to say that the 2 of them actually appointed a shliach to dig the pit, v'amrin le zil krilon, and they said to him, go dig for us a pit, v'azal karalu, and he dug the pit, and so then you're saying they're essentially partners. That's not true. The rule is ein shliach lidvar avera. The rule is you can't have a shliach for a dvar avera, meaning to say the person who actually dug the pit in that case is going to be responsible. We don't say that since they made him a shliach, suddenly they're the ones that are chayiv. As Rashi says, "Ein shliach l'dvar aver l'schayev sholcho." You don't say that the person who sent the messenger, who sent the agent, is chayev. Ela shliach mechayev. You're always going to say that the shliach, the agent himself, is chayev. Usvaru, and that's just a logical rule. The amrinan le divrei harav, divrei hatalmud, divrei mishom. And we tell the shliach, you have the words of the master, that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you have the words of the student, that's the person who sent you. Who are you supposed to listen to? Of course, you're supposed to listen to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's why we say "Ein shliach l'dvar aver." That's why we say the shliach would be responsible. And so the Gemara continues. So now maybe you're going to say that the case is that one of the partners dug 5 tefachim and the other one dug the other 5 tefachim. But if that's the case, nistalku lahu ma'aser rishon, the first person, what he did the first 5, that's actually been completely replaced by the second individual, and the first person would not be responsible. He would not be considered a partner in that bor. And the Gemara continues, Hanichol Rebbe. Now we could work it out according to Rebbe Ulin Izakin and talking specifically about damages. Mashkachas law, it actually works out because Rebbe happens to hold, as we'll see in a moment, that the first person actually is still responsible for damages in such a case because he dug 5 tvachim, which could in theory damage a person. Elul Rebbe Ulamisa. But if you're talking about Rebbe in terms of death, let's say an animal died in that pit, so Rebbe says only the second person is responsible there. Ul Rabbanan, and according to the Rabbanan, Bein Lamisa Bein Lenizakin. Actually, whether it's for death or whether it's for nizakin, the Rabbanan say it's only the second individual that is chayiv. So again, we're back to our question, Hechi mashkachas la, how do we find such a case? And the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Kagon sha'akru shnehen chulya bevasachas v'shalimu la'asar, that together they dig that last amount to make it 10 tefachim, and that's how you can have a situation of partners where they're both responsible. And Rashi explains, Hanichol the Rebbe damar l'kamon achar shnehen l'nizakin. Rebbe says that both of them are responsible in such a pit in terms of damages. Uvenizakin mashkachas lo de tarvayu mechayivi. Again, by nizikin you can find such a thing according to Rebbe. Elul Rebbe ulamisa, but according to Rebbe, when it comes to death, devemisa moda de achron chayiv. Rebbe admits that in terms of death, let's say the animal dies in the pit, only the last person is chayiv. Velo rishon, and not the first person. Hechi mashkachas la, how is it going to work out? And again, according to the Rabbanan, whether we're talking about misa or nizakin, it doesn't really work. And then ultimately the Gemara answered with Rabbi Yochanan's answer, Sha'akru shneim. Rashi says that they both, Shechafar ha'echatisha, one of them dug 9 tvachim, Ubachaveru v'sayu v'akru b'vasachas, chulim mikarka osav, and then his friend came along and he helped on the last tefach, v'shalimu la'asar, completed it to 10, te'in kan achron, the tarvayu ki adadi, mashvulei bor. In this case, they both together made it a pit, uvein l'Rebbe, uvein l'Rabbanan, chayavin b'misa, whether you're following Rebbe or the Rabbanan, they're both going to be chayiv in terms of, let's say, an animal dies in the pit, v'kol shekein b'nizachin, and certainly in a situation where it is a case of damage. And the Gemara continues, My Rebbe, my Rabbanan. What is this machlokis Rebbe and the Rabbanan that we just referred to? The Tanya, as we learned in a braysa, Echad hachofer bor tisha uboachar v'shlima la'asara. Let's say one person digs the pit 9 tvachim and then another person makes it 10 tvachim. Ha'acharon chayiv. The Tana Kama says it's the last person who's going to be responsible, who's going to be chayiv. Rebbe says, Achar acharon lamisa. The last person will be responsible. Let's say an animal falls in there and dies in the pit. However, v'achar shneim l'nizakin. But if in terms of damages, in terms of injuries, so they're both going to be responsible because the 9 tvachim also is able to create nezik, it's able to create damage. And the Gemara says, My time of the Rabbanan, what's the reason of the Rabbanan? Why do the Rabbanan say that we follow that last person? The Yomar Krutz, because the pasuk says, Ki yiftach v'chiyichre. Again, it says that the person opens the pit, and then it talks about the person digging the pit. Why does it have to say both? Im al psicha chayiv al kriya lo kol shekain. If you're chayiv for opening the pit, aren't you most certainly chayiv for digging the pit? Elalahavi kora achar kora. What the pasuk is trying to say is, if you have one person dig after another person, so then shasilek ma'aser rishon, that removes what the first person did, and therefore the last person is ultimately responsible. And the Gemara says, Rebbe, now Rebbe, how does he respond? How does he learn this pasuk of ki yiftach v'chiyichre? Amar lach, he'll say to you, Hanu mitzrach tzricha kedamrinan. We've actually dealt with these psukim earlier in the Gemara, gave various reasons why the pasuk needs to say both ki yiftach and ki yichre. Rashi says that's Keda Amr Le'el. Rashi says Mitzrach Tzrichi Keda Amr Le'el B'Pirkin. We said earlier in the parak Daf Nun Amar Aleph, and so therefore we need this psukim. So you can't learn from this pasuk this idea of the Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues, Rabbanan Nami. The truth is the Rabbanan also Mitzrach Tzrichi. They do need the pasuk for something else. This cannot possibly be the source. There must be another source. And so the Gemara says, Elahainu time of the Rabbanan. Rather, the reason of the Rabbanan is as follows. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Ki yichre ish. It says, Ki yichre ish bor echod v'lo shnayim. It says that a person digs a pit. It means one person and not two people. As Rashi says, Echod v'lo beis miyate kra l'rishon. The pasuk is essentially excluding that first person who did the digging. Kenem efarsh l'kamei. That's going to be explained later on. V'chi miyate l'nizak and miyate. And what's being excluded over here? But what's being excluded is obviously nizak and his injury, his damage. The imi misa, because it's obvious misa. You don't even need to exclude it. Lo itzrich kra. We wouldn't need the pasuk. To lo avet shir misa. The person didn't even dig it enough to create a death, and so therefore you see from this pasuk of ki yichre ishbor echad v'lo shnayim. V'Rebbe and Rebbe hahumi boile, so he needs to use that pasuk as follows: ki yichre ishbor v'lo shorbor. Pasuk is saying that it's when a man digs a pit, but you're not responsible if the shore is the one that digs the pit. But the Rabbanan respond to that. V'Rabbanan and the Rabbanan respond trei ishbor ksivi. It actually says ishbor. It says it 2 times in the pasuk, so one of them can be ishbor v'lo shorbor, but the other one can be the drush of echad v'lo shnayim. And the Gemara continues, V'Rebbe, and what does Rebbe do with the fact that Ish is written twice? Idi the Kosav Hai. Since it already says Ish one time, it says it the second time as well. It's not meant to be for a drasha. And the Gemara continues, Basra. Now, how do you know, even if you have this pasuk of Echad v'lo shnayim, that one is responsible and not the second one, how do you know that it's to make that second person, the last one, is chayiv? Kamma. Maybe what it means is one person is chayiv. The first one is the one that's chayiv. And the Gemara says to that, don't think that that is the case. Because the pasuk says, V'hameis yelo, the pasuk says, and the mace will be to him. Earlier in the Mesechet, we dealt with who is the him, who does the mace belong to, but either way, hahu dekav in misa, we learn from the pasuk v'hamesi yelo that it's always the person who created the boar that it would be able to kill. That's the person, meaning that last person, who's ultimately responsible. But the Gemara continues, v'hai v'hamesi yelo mi boile l'chid Rava. Don't we need v'hamesi yelo for a different drasha? Don't we need it for the drasha of Rava? The Yamar Rava, because Rava says shor psule hamukdashin. If you have a shor, now this shor is not hektish, but it's disqualified hektish. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Shenafal lebor. If such a shor falls into a pit, so pater is pater. Why? Shenever, because the pasuk says v'hamesi yelo. It says that the carcass of the animal will be to him, as if he can take whoever it is, as if he can take possession of it. But misha hamesh yelo. But it has to be something that you really can take possession of. You can't really take full possession of shor psule hamukdashin, as we'll see in Rashi. There are certain restrictions, but in any case, that's what v'hamesi yelo is for. So you can't say v'hamesi yelo is to say that the last person is chayiv as opposed to the first person who dug. And the Gemara says to that, Amri, the answer to that, V'lav memela shamat mina. It's true, you can make that drasha, but nevertheless, along the way, we learn this other idea, Devahu da'avan misaskinan, that we're dealing with the person that created the circumstances that caused the death. So we essentially learn out both ideas. And Rashi explains, shor psule hamukdash, and again we're talking about a shor of disqualified hektish that falls in the pit. We say that the person who made the pit is potter in that case. Kagon bechor balmum. There's some examples of this. For example, let's say a bechor develops a blemish, shehu shel kohen, so that becomes the property of the kohen, but again it's disqualified in terms of the halachas of having that kedusha of bechor. The karin on beis shor reyehu. Now that's called shor reyehu. It's considered that it belongs to the kohen. It's not shor shel hektish. The idea is, we'll see in a moment, is a shor of hektish is not counted in any kinds of damages because it has to be shor reyehu. That's what it says when it talks about keren. But this is shor reyehu, so this would be chayiv in terms of keren. O shor korban shenafal balmum. Another case of disqualified hektish, it could be either a bechor balmum or it could be a shor that's a korban that has a mum v'nifta and then it's redeemed. The karina beis shor reyehu. Again, that's also called shor reyehu. That's considered not to belong to hektish but to the individual. Now, even though it's shor reyehu, and in terms of keren there would be a chiyuv, v'afilu hachi linyan bor pater. The point over here is nevertheless in terms of bor, the shor psuli hamukdashin is going to be pater, even though let's say by shor it's not pater. Techsiv v'hamesi elo, because by bor it says v'hamesi elo, misharoi lo lahachil nevelaso leklavim. It has to be that you can take that mace and feed that carcass to dogs. Yotza zev v'chulu. That excludes shor psuli hamukdashin. That kind of use, for example, is not allowed. Ta'achei amrina bebechoros, because that's what we say in bechoros. Gabe psuli hamukdashin sheniftu. When we talk about disqualified hektish that's redeemed, it says tizbach v'lo giza. It says you can slaughter it, but you're not allowed to use the shearings. Basar for the meat, v'lo chalav, you can't milk the animal. V'yachalta, you eat it, v'lo leklavecha, but it can't go to your dogs. Meaning to say there are these various restrictions. Avol shor shenag chochayev, but let's say a shor would gore a shor psul hamukdash b'chayev, k'dim mefarish l'kamei b'pirk, and that's going to be explained later on in the parak. And Rashi points out, as we said, the reason why we specifically are talking about psule hamukdashim, to ilu kachim tamim, because if it was, let's say, regular kachim, an actual animal that's designated to be a carbon that doesn't have a mum, so ma'ir yabor, you don't have to talk about bor being pater. It's always pater. Afilu shor shenag chonami pater. Even if a shor would gore it would be pater. Dechsiv shor reyehu v'lo shor hektish, because the halacha by the goring is only by shor reyehu. It doesn't apply to a shor of hektish, and so again, that's why the Gemara specifically is talking about psule hamukdashin over here. And then the Gemara said, lav memela, but don't you see anyway, you say this other idea also, that it's the last person that's chayiv, kolomar tarti shamat minei. That's another way of the Gemara saying, we're able to learn out both halachas from the hameis yelo. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabban, and the rabbis taught, Echad achofer bor asara ba'achar v'shlima l'chaf. Let's say one person digs it 10 tvachim, and then someone else makes it 20 tvachim. Uba'achar v'shlima l'shloshim. Then someone else comes along and makes it 30 tvachim. Kulan chayavin. They're all going to be chayiv. The Gemara says, Uraminu, but we have a contradiction to that. Echad achofer bor asara. It says, let's say one person digs it 10 tvachim. Uba'achar v'sayid v'chayid. And then somebody else comes and he plasters essentially around it. Ha'achron chayiv. The last person is chayiv. And Rashi says, Sayid v'chayit shemitchilo rochav haya. The point is, originally it was very wide. When it was first dug, it was very wide. V'lo haya bo hevel kolkach. And there wasn't so much hevel. V'zeh shesayidu ketzar. And then this person who kind of filled it in, plastered around it, he made it more narrow, and that caused that it now had the hevel. Kayid asabot siyurin b'ksalim b'tiach asid shatachbo. Again, he made these kinds of images along the wall in the pit, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph.